Today on the Perception and Action podcast, an ecological approach to preventing and adapting to sports injury. To what extent can we predict injury from technique? How is injury risk related to movement variability and attentional focus? Can we reduce risk by increasing variability through training? So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. On today's episode, I want to look at injury prevention and adaptation from an ecological perspective, and also explain why I don't really like the term injury rehabilitation. If you think about traditional views about why injuries occur, there are two ideas that have persisted. You're doing it wrong, and or you're doing it too much. First, it's thought that injuries occur when there's a technical flaw in the execution of a skill. That is, the movement deviates from some ideal. Your knees are over your toes, your shoulder is flying open, etc. The second popular idea has been the basic overuse explanation. That is that many movements, like pitching a baseball for example, cause extreme stressors on the body that cannot be avoided. Therefore, the only way to mitigate injury is by managing load. This is captured in the common expression you hear in baseball, a pitcher only has so many bullets in their gun, so you have to save them. Today, I want to challenge some of these ideas and address the possibility that the very way in which we are teaching skills and rehabbing injury may be contributing to the problem. First off, to what extent are injuries caused by technical flaws? Can we actually predict injury by doing a movement analysis and identifying these flaws in an individual performer? This possibility was recently investigated in a study of baseball pitchers by Sutter and colleagues. In the study, the authors focused on the shoulder and elbow injuries in baseball pitchers, which if you follow baseball at all will know are far too common. For more information, listen back to my review of the book The Arm in episode 35A. The goal of the study by Sutter et al. Was to generate a model that can predict injury risk based on the evaluation of key technical components of the pitching delivery. To achieve this end, the authors collected MLB game videos from games played starting in 1920. So this obviously involved both current and former players, ranging in birth date from 1921 to 1996. Along with the decade in which they played, demographic information collected included their injury history and whether they were primarily a starting pitcher or a relief pitcher. For each pitcher, 3 deliveries recorded from both a side view and from behind were used. Videos were analyzed and scored in terms of 6 pitching technique components: mass and momentum, arm swing, posture, position at foot strike, path of arm acceleration, and finish. Here are some quotes from the paper that give examples of a few of these. Mass and momentum measures the angle between the vertical line and the axis of the drive leg when the lead foot is in line with the lead hip during early push-off. A larger angle indicates that the lower body and pelvis are moving toward the target in concert and constitutes a higher score. Posture relates to the positioning of the head and the trunk as the body moves towards the target, before the front foot contacts the ground. Specifically, using the center field view, this is whether the trunk was flexed or extended relative to a vertical axis at ball-glove separation and at foot strike. Path of arm acceleration refers to the path of the ball between the late cocking phase of throwing, maximal shoulder external rotation, and ball release. From the center field view, the angle between these 2 points can be measured from the horizontal to quantify the quote-unquote arm slot. The authors didn't provide many details about how they chose these components, but from my experience, they are very similar to what is found in most quote-unquote pitching textbooks. As you can see from these descriptions, they are focused on relative angles and positions during the delivery. I like this because instead of just looking at something like the maximum elbow angle or shoulder extension, it actually addresses the issue of movement coordination. For each video, each of the 6 technical components was given a score from 0 to 4, where 4 is perfect technique. The score was then summed to give an overall technical score out of 24 for each pitcher. Here is where I have a problem with this study. The scoring was done by a single rater that was one of the authors of the paper. That's problematic enough, but there's even something more serious. I think it's reasonable to assume that the rater is a baseball fan. Therefore, because they are using videos from Major League Baseball, it's highly likely they would recognize some of the pitchers and know something about them, even though the paper says they were quote-unquote blinded to injury history. For example, what would happen if I were doing the rating and one of the videos showed Mark Pryor, a pitcher for the Chicago Cubs whose career famously ended early due to injury? It would be very difficult for me to not at least subconsciously give him a lower technique score, given what I know about the outcome of his career. This is a very well-studied effect in psychology known as hindsight bias. On the plus side, they did address an issue that is common in doing biomechanical assessments from videos or photographs. Specifically, they showed there was no significant effect of camera angle. To analyze the data, the authors used what is called a survival analysis. This is basically a type of regression which uses a series of independent variables, in this case the demographics and the 6 pitching technique scores, to give an estimate of the relative risk of an event, in this case, a major upper extremity injury. What was found? The final dataset included 449 different players who had a total of 375 injuries. The demographics that were significant in the model were not surprising. Older pitchers, starting pitchers, and those with a previous injury history all had a significantly greater risk of injury in the future. Relative to a pitcher with no injury history, 1 injury increased the relative risk to 2 times, 2 previous injuries increased it to 3 times as likely, and 3 previous injuries increased it to 6 times as likely. Interestingly, the authors found a time period effect, which they hypothesized was the result of the change in the way pitchers were instructed. Specifically, in 1975, the authors proposed the popularity of the drop and drive pitching delivery method would lead to a significantly different technical score before and after this date. And indeed, that was what was found. Pitchers born after 1975 scored about 1.5 points less on total technical score as compared to pitchers born before this date. Most importantly, though, what was the relationship between individual technical scores and injury? It was found that 3 of the 6 variables were significant predictors in the model. Risk of injury significantly decreased with an increase in overall delivery score by about 7.8%. And independently with an increase in the score of mass and momentum by 16%, arm swing 12%, and position at foot strike 22%. The accuracy of the model in predicting injury was significantly better when including total delivery score as compared with the demographic factors alone. Finally, when comparing 2 pitchers directly, the model predicted which would suffer a major upper extremity injury first with an accuracy of 70%. So a few thoughts on this paper. Putting the potential biased rating system aside, there does seem to be some clear relationships between technique and injury. This is essentially consistent with the idea that I keep emphasizing on the podcast. All skills have a relatively small set of invariant features that we can identify. Deviating from these, what are often called fundamentals, can result in both a decrease in performance and increased injury risk. But what we have to be careful about is taking this too far. As we can see in the results of this study, even when we combine all of these well-known quote-unquote technical flaws in pitching, there is only about an 8% increase in the relative risk of injury. So there's clearly a lot more to the story of injury than just deviations from some ideal technique. A second point I would emphasize is that often what we identify as technical issues for injury also have clear performance effects. To quote the authors about pitching, an emphasis on fluid timing has emerged such that the proper coordination of proximal segments will maximize angular velocity of the distal segments with less upper extremity torque. End quote. Many of the technical components used in the study as potential injury causes would also likely result in poorer pitching performance. Specifically, many of the issues identified would serve to break the kinetic chain in the delivery, which would presumably result in lower velocity and perhaps less control. Finally, a critical issue to think about is what do we do with this information once we find a quote-unquote technical flaw that might cause injury? As I talked about back in episode 79, previous studies have shown that giving an athlete information about the flaw in the form described in the study, that is, detailed biomechanical descriptors of the issue, or even videos showing and illustrating it, are relatively ineffective in changing the technique. Specifically, a study by Fleissig and colleagues showed that this led to about only a 40% of the flaws being corrected. Obviously, I would prefer using a CLA approach, or something like a connection ball, as opposed to giving the athlete tons of explicit detail about the technical issue. Okay, that's the injury is due to poor technique explanation. What about the other common explanation for the cause of injury? Overuse. This is the basic idea that repeated load application in the execution of a skill will eventually lead to mechanical breakdown and subsequent injury. You will run out of bullets in your gun. In a review article published in 2019, Noden and Dufek review an interesting twist on this idea called the Variability-Overuse Hypothesis, first proposed by James in 2004. This idea starts the same as the traditional overuse hypothesis. Repeated load application leads to mechanical tissue breakdown and subsequent injury. But it adds something important to it. This will occur when there's not enough variability in the movement to allow for adaptation. So basically, overuse is only bad when the movement has very low variability. With higher variability and movement degeneracy, there's room for adaptation and less chance of injury. To quote the paper, the role of movement variability in musculoskeletal health has been linked to stressor magnitudes, frequency, and rates of adaptation, with proposed functional variability limits underlying acute and overuse injury mechanisms. In 2004, James, however, attributed overuse injury mechanisms to repeated loadings of sufficient magnitude and frequency that outpace physiological adaptations in the variability-overuse injury hypothesis. Lesser trial-to-trial movement variability was considered characteristic of the latter, where broader distribution of loads among tissues, including location, direction, magnitude, and frequency, allowed time for adaptation. End quote. So using a variable shooting technique gives you a lot more bullets in your gun, if you will. Or put another way, as Bernstein showed us, variations from one repetition of a skill to another are not only unavoidable, but they also seem to be essential for healthy functioning of our body. This is why some people have proposed that everyone has slightly asymmetrical leg lengths. It serves to increase their variation. The article makes the important point that not all variability in movement is good, however. Excessive movement variability is likely to increase the chance of an acute injury, of course. With increased practice hours in a skill, we see the overall variability tends to decrease, particularly if we focus on discrete measures like the standard deviation of body angles and the endpoints of movements. However, this reduction is systematic, in that not all variation goes down as would be predicted from the traditional variability is noise explanation. Research on reaching movements, for example, has shown that when we practice, we tend to minimize effort by distributing the motor commands across multiple effectors. This results in variation in our movements that is anisotropic or direction dependent. If you look along one dimension, it will be low in a skilled performer, while in another it will be high. This is, of course, also the essential idea of the uncontrolled manifold hypothesis. That is that with practice, variability along the goal-directed dimension, bad variability that takes you away from your goal, is corrected and reduced, while variation along task-irrelevant dimensions, good variability that gives you room for adapting to changing constraints, is allowed to accumulate. James's variability overuse model discussed in this paper can be represented by a 3D space, with task demands or load on one axis, movement variability on the second axis, and likelihood of overuse injury on the third. With an increase in load, there's an increase in injury. That's the traditional overuse idea. But this can be mitigated by the amount of movement variability. Quote, the emergence of a single motor strategy might characterize a constrained solution space that is linked to a decrease in trial-to-trial movement variability described in the variability-overuse injury hypothesis. Imposing constraints on the biomechanical limits the emergent load accumulation strategies. From this perspective, the introduction of small changes in performance avoids the repeated application of stress to identical tissues, more broadly distributing loads and avoiding the likelihood of overuse injuries. As the stressor increases, however, the ability of the neuromuscular system to achieve negative biomechanical or fully accommodating responses is plausibly exceeded. This hypothesis outlines a scenario in landing where at the upper limit of task demands, participants are constrained to positive biomechanical strategies within a limited variability range. End quote. So having more available task solutions, aka functional variability, allows the system to adapt to higher task loads and reduce the chance of injury. However, there's going to be a limit to this. If the load gets too high and is too close to a performer's maximum capacity, there will be no longer room for adaptation. This is something Paula Silva emphasized in our interview back in episode 308. There's no room for a performer to adapt to stressors if they're pushed right up to their capacity. Consistent with these ideas, research has shown that with increased task demands or load, there's a decrease in trial-to-trial movement variability, and thus an increase in the likelihood of an overuse injury. For example, in research looking at jump landings, which is what is focused on in this review article, it has been found that when landing from greater heights or with greater loads, there are decreases in discrete measures of variability. For example, the standard deviations of knee angle, ankle, and hip joints. However, when time series or principal components analyses of variability are used, it has been found that, quote, when landing from greater landing height and with greater load, participants exploited covariation among time series variables across the landing phase. Dimension reduction was therefore achieved through neural and mechanical synergies, aligning with motor control predictions, end quote. In other words, although overall variability was decreased, there was still evidence of functional variability in the coupling between joints. Evidence consistent with the variability-overuse hypothesis can also be seen when looking at how variability relates to other factors known to cause injury. For example, individuals with chronic ankle instability have also shown reduced variability at hip and knee joints compared to healthy controls during single-leg jump landings. And a significantly more reduced kinetic variability has been reported during unanticipated cutting maneuvers in athletes with history of growing pain compared to healthy controls. So in sum, although there is no doubt that quote-unquote doing too much in terms of load and number of repetitions can increase the chance of an overuse injury, this simple effect can be offset by the very thing we didn't want in the first paper I discussed today, variations in technique. Is there any more direct evidence to support the benefits of movement variability in reducing injury? For example, if we could increase variability in training, would it help to reduce injury? In an interesting study published earlier this year, Bonacci and colleagues provide some evidence to support this idea. In this article, the authors focus on patellofemoral pain, PFP, or what is more commonly known as runner's knee. This is chronic pain around or behind the kneecap that gets worsened by load-bearing activities like running. Consistent with the ideas I've been discussing today, it's been found that runners with PFP have less joint variability as compared to healthy controls. But as a coach or physical therapist, what can we do to encourage PFP runners to adopt a movement solution with higher variability? Well, if we subscribe to the CLA, we can achieve this by adding a new task constraint. And this is exactly what Bonacci and colleagues have found in previous work. Specifically, having runners with PFP run at a progressively increasing cadence results in an increase in joint variability and a reduction in reported pain. The authors nicely describe the effect of adding this constraint. Quote, gait retraining is a process of learning a new motor pattern. Variability of motor performance plays an important role in learning a new task, such as running with an increased cadence. The joint movements required to achieve this new cadence are likely to be variable and may reflect the motor system's exploration of different movement strategies. End quote. This raises an important point that the authors sought to address in this current study. Is this variability shown in a single session of cadence training just from exploration, such that it might disappear when the runner finds a new preferred cadence? Quote, it is unclear if the increased joint variability persists once the new motor pattern is learned and symptoms have improved. Well-learned movements are often associated with consistent performance, but expert performance typically retains high segment coordination variability. This maintenance of variability may provide the motor system with flexibility to find the optimal movement solutions at any given time, and could be important to manage PFP symptoms during and post-gait retraining." End quote. So in other words, if we really want to reduce the chance of an overuse injury and associated pain, we need the variability seen in training to persist to allow for adaptation, as I discussed earlier. To explore this issue, the authors investigated the effects of a 6-week physiotherapist-guided gait retraining program on 6 runners with PFP. The training intervention involved running on a treadmill with minimalist shoes with a program designed to increase cadence. Following a measure of their baseline cadence, each session involved training the runner to increase their cadence by 10%. This was supported via a metronome and verbal feedback from a therapist, which consisted only of comments about whether they were running at too low or too high a cadence. They were encouraged to land softly, but otherwise were given no instructions about how to run. The metronome was removed in the post-training test in week 6. Along the way, measures of self-reported knee pain were also taken. Lower limb joint variability and joint segment coordination measures were taken at baseline, 6 weeks, so at the end of training, and at a 12-week retention test using a Viacom motion tracking system. Joint variability was assessed using a measure called approximate entropy. This is essentially the consistency or regularity of the movement pattern, measured by assessing the likelihood similar patterns would be seen later in the time series. So higher entropy means less consistency and more variability. Joint segment coordination was assessed by looking at the coupling between pairs of joints, which I discussed in detail back in episode 185 when I looked at coordinating degrees of freedom. As the authors put it, quote, "Learning a new task may reduce segment coordination variability, i.e. freezing. Reduced segment coordination variability may represent a reduction in interacting degrees of freedom in a more constrained movement pattern. Evidence suggests that individuals with PFP have altered segment coordination variability during running compared to healthy individuals." End quote. So these are definitely not your granddad's variability measures. I love that they're looking at the whole time series and the coordination between joints. What was found? First and most importantly, there was a significant reduction in reported pain at both 6 and 12 weeks compared to baseline. For the joint variability measure, there was significant increase in entropy, so an increase in variability, for the ankle, knee, and hip. Compared to baseline, variability differences were seen at both 6 and 12 weeks and were largest for the ankle. Finally, what about segment coordination? For this, it was found that there was no significant change after training. One way that we can interpret these findings is in terms of Newell's coordination and control concepts I discussed in the last episode. The fact that there was no change in joint segment coordination suggests that cadence training does not alter coordination. In other words, it won't result in a completely new movement solution. Instead, given that joint variability did change, it suggests that training resulted in control changes. That is, adaptation by reparameterizing the values in the coordination solution. One thing that was lacking in this study was a healthy control group for comparison. For example, it would be interesting to test whether the patterns of joint coordination were similar for the two. Interestingly, previous research has shown that this type of cadence training has almost the exact opposite effect in runners without PFP. It significantly reduces variability. So although I think there's some more interesting work to do here, the results support the idea that increasing variability reduces pain and presumably the chance of injury. So, adding a task constraint to practice, like increasing cadence, is one way we can increase variability in an effort to reduce injury. Are there other ways? A recent study by Mercado and Palomino and colleagues suggests that another way this can be achieved is by having more representative practice design. In their study, the authors consider movements in volleyball. In particular, they emphasize the important distinction between planned and unplanned movements. Quote, "In volleyball, only a small change in the contextual situation can cause the player to have to modify their movement patterns. One example of this is a response to an unpredictable or unplanned situation, such as a change of direction to block a shot. However, the majority of studies that have considered the movement patterns during tasks associated with injury risk factors have not considered the uncertainty and speed of the real game, due to difficulties in controlling such factors in a laboratory situation. Most interventions, whose principal aim is to improve motor control in order to reduce the incidence of injury during sports games, are through training using isolated tasks. However, injuries very seldom occur when performing an isolated task in a predictable environment, but occur more in unplanned environments." End quote. It's also likely that this overemphasis on planned movements and training is likely to impair the development of healthy movement variability we've been discussing today, and it also limits a coach's ability to detect risky patterns related to this. We know that more conscious planned movements, particularly those with heavily internally focused instructions, can lead to a type of control where the body is heavily constrained, leading to less variability. To explore these ideas, the authors conducted a study to compare the variability of movements in planned and unplanned situations in volleyball. In a within-subjects design, 12 semi-pro players were asked to move to block at one of 3 locations above the net. In the planned condition, the location was given before the run-up was initiated, whereas in the unplanned condition, it was signaled during the run-up via fit lights mounted above the net that were turned on once the run-up has started. There was also variations in direction. So one clear limitation here for me, obviously, no perception-action coupling. By using fit lights, you're making the task reactive and unplanned, but you're taking away the information that naturally supports these movements. In both conditions, participants were instructed to move and block the shot in the shortest possible amount of time, which was measured by taking the time it took to turn off the light by waving your hand in front of it. Ground reaction forces were measured with force plates mounted on the court, and a motion capture system was used to measure movement data. What was found? Force plate data revealed that the power and energy absorption in the knee was significantly higher in the planned condition as compared to the unplanned condition. Motion capture data revealed that there was greater peak knee flexion and internal rotation for the planned movements. Finally, for knee and hip measures, there was evidence of greater variability in the unplanned condition. So we can see a few different problems here. An overemphasis on planned movements creates patterns, greater angles, rotations, energy absorption, and less variability that are likely to cause overuse injuries. Given the differences seen in the unplanned condition, and consistent with the variability-overuse hypothesis we've been considering today, it's likely these patterns occur because the movement is overly constrained and has less variability when planned. Adding more unplanned and unpredictable movements in practice is not only more representative of what a performer is going to actually face in competition, but it's also likely to give them more opportunity to develop this injury-reducing adaptive variability. Finally today, I want to focus on what happens if an athlete does get injured. As I've expressed in a few presentations I've given, I really think we should switch to using the term adaptation to injury instead of injury rehabilitation or injury recovery. Why? Rehabilitation or recovery implies that the way that we should deal with the injury is by trying to get back to where we were before it happened. To me, this idea is flawed and counterproductive because I think it's impossible. The bad news is that you can't go home again, my friends. Or as a wise person once said, you can never step in the same river twice. Injury imposes some completely new constraints on solving a movement problem, such that it really should be considered to be a completely new problem for the performer. I will get into specific examples of this in a second. But first, there is good news here. Adapting to new movement problems imposed by changing constraints is something an athlete has done and will do through their entire career. Changes produced by body growth, moving to higher skill levels, changes in rules or equipment are just a few examples. The river is always flowing. Injury is just another part of the flow. Let's look at a couple studies that support my view. First, in an interesting paper published by Neto and colleagues in 2019, research investigating changes in our brain associated with an ACL injury was reviewed. It is well known that there's a high rate of ACL re-injury after surgery, of about 30%, even in young active adults. One of the main reasons I think this occurs is the rehab or trying to go back problem. That is the failure to take into account the new reality of the new constraints imposed on the performer. Several recent studies have shown long-term functional changes in the sensory and motor areas of the brain following ACL injury. Moreover, reconstruction of the ACL does not seem to influence these neuroplastic changes, as patients with ACL reconstruction continue to show changes in neural activity. Even athletes who are successfully able to return to their sport after ACL injury show different brain activity as compared to healthy controls. So what are we talking about here specifically? Quote, Several studies using different techniques to measure brain activity showed higher levels of activity recorded in the motor areas. Compared to healthy participants, those with ACL injury, with or without reconstruction, recruited the motor cortex to a larger extent, even in simple tasks such as joint angle reproduction. A possible explanation for this may be related to the depressed motor cortex excitability shown in people with ACL injury, which means that higher motor cortex activity is necessary to achieve efferent drive, end quote. And quote, studies performing spectral power analysis reported higher theta power in the frontal cortex. As this area of the brain has been linked to focused attention and working memory, it seems that after an ACL injury, more neurocognitive resources are necessary to conduct simple motor tasks. Finally, there's some evidence of disrupted proprioceptive and tactile processing following ACL injury, which is exacerbated by the noise in the system added from pain receptors and inflammation. Interestingly, these deficits seem to be partially compensated for by greater activity in the visual areas of the brain during movement, suggesting a change in information-movement coupling. Some research I conducted a few years ago is also consistent with these findings. In a study published in the Journal of Sport and Exercise Psychology in 2015, I investigated the attentional focus of expert baseball position players recovering from knee surgery and baseball pitchers recovering from elbow injury, as compared to healthy controls. To achieve this, I used the attentional probe paradigm I've used in several studies now. With this, I present a brief sound while the player is either swinging the bat or pitching the ball. On separate trials, they're asked to make judgments about the angle of their arm, the angle of their knee, or the position of the ball, at the point when they heard the sound. I then use response accuracy as a measure of attentional focus. If you have higher accuracy, I assume it's because you are focusing on that thing. What you're asked to make the judgment about is chosen randomly, so the task itself does not shift the attentional focus. For batting, I found that there was no difference between the injured and non-injured experts when making a judgment about their arm, but there was a significant difference, with the batters recovering from ACL injury being more accurate when making a judgment about their knee angle. This is consistent with the idea that injury induces an internal focus of attention on the injured body part. For pitching, the story was a bit different. Pitchers recovering from UCL elbow surgery were more accurate at judging both their knee and elbow angle as compared to healthy controls. Thus, this injury seemed to induce a more diffuse internal focus, not just on the injured body part itself. I argued that this occurred because for a pitcher, how the leg moves is going to impact the stress put on the elbow. Finally, while I was working on today's episode, I went back and looked at the ground reaction force data I collected in that study, but never published. And consistent with some of the other studies I've talked about today, I found lower variability in the timing of the movements for both injured batters and injured pitchers as compared to the healthy controls. So in sum, injury seems to fundamentally alter the constraints placed on our perceptual motor system. And these are not just simple short-term changes. We attend to different locations, have differences in the information we get, have different calibration between inputs and motor outputs, and seem to use more constrained, visually based form of skill execution, at least initially. This is the new reality, such that any quote-unquote rehab program needs to take this into account and develop interventions to improve performance from this point, not try to get the athlete back to the way they moved before. Not only is that likely to be impossible, it's likely to be no longer the optimal solution for the performer given their new constraints. To sum up today's episode, I think we need to dramatically change the way we think about injury prevention and adaptation, not recovery, in sports. Injuries are not simply caused by doing things the wrong way or doing them too much. Yes, there can be some technical invariants that if execution deviates too far from them may cause injury, and that we might want to try to destabilize by using a method like the CLA. However, these are relatively few in number, and by overemphasizing one correct technique, we are hindering the development of good movement variability, which, as I discussed today, can mitigate the high bodily stresses from overuse in sports by allowing for functional adaptations. Finally, most major sports injuries result in a substantial change in the constraints facing a performer, such that we don't want to try to return them to where they were as much as develop interventions for them to find a new effective movement solution. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at Shakeaways. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials including written transcripts or work with me one-on-one, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.
Now you're the winter. We'll cut you quick.